My experience during the civil rights movement, at the time, I was basically a teenager. Um, Around 1960, 61 was about the first time I heard about developments with regard to the civil rights movement when the black students from, I think it was North Carolina A&T, staged the sit-ins. And that was when things, I guess, kind of got rolling.
Well, the civil rights movement began very early for me as a child because of being raised in the Quaker religion and heritage. And so I was always aware that there were issues and that I was encouraged to express myself.
The civil rights movement here in St. Petersburg was nothing like it was in Birmingham or Jackson, Mississippi, or Selma or Montgomery. But we did have our own civil rights movement. We had the riot of 1968, which took place about 2 weeks before my wedding to my children's father, which caused my oldest brother to be incarcerated because of a curfew that they had here in the city. I can recall the city purchasing or borrowing an armored tank that went down 22nd Street and other streets to in the black community to enforce the curfew, but it also spewed tear gas in our communities. And I remember being at a girlfriend's house, and there were about 5 of us and her mother. We couldn't go home that night because of the tear gas that was all around.
And here in St. Petersburg, we had a garbage strike. And Dr. King actually came to the city. Stokely Carmichael also came here. He was the president, I think at the time, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, they called it at the time. And I remember watching him sit on the hood of a car on 22nd Street and talking a lot of smack. You know, it was young, dynamic, a new generation of young black people who refused to accept the old ways. Times were changing.
You know, besides Dr. King, you know, I've been listing Jackie Robinson as my next person because I've read a lot lately about their relationship, and it appears that Dr. King gave Jackie Robinson a lot of credit for helping that movement to get started. Obviously, it was just professional sports, but there was somehow Dr. King interpreted that as it's pretty meaningful, and they got to be good friends, did some activities together. So I think that with Jackie's breaking into baseball, it encouraged King to continue his line of thinking about how we could successfully break through many of the other barriers. And of course, my local hero then was Dr. Reverend Eno D. Davis. He was the man that sort of was at the leadership of movement in this city and very well respected.
Eno Davis was a quiet, respectable, full of action man, and he walked with dignity. His church was on 16th Street and 5th Avenue South. And at that time, his house he lived next from the church. But everybody had respect for him, for who he was, for what he did. And when he decided to do something, he didn't have to seek the community. The community came behind him to support him, whatever issue was available for us to deal with. He was able to move quietly, yet strongly and boldly, with the support of the whole city.
Well, a lot of the progress, social progress we've made, political progress, when the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964, that helped to spearhead the growth and development of black people as a group. Even if you go back to the Supreme Court decision of that year when segregation in the schools were outlawed, where the Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned. That case was at Topeka, Kansas Board of Education, where the Supreme Court ruled against them. That was, to me, the start of some change in the country, even though it took several years before the integration was actually implemented in the schools. That was a start. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when President Johnson signed that act, and Dr. King was right there next to him, that made a big difference in housing. The Voters' Right Act, which unfortunately has been overturned. I mean, that was great. That was great for black people in terms of progress.
Well, when you look back on the last 50 years, since 1968, I think it's, the proverbial, the glass is half full and half empty, both, depending on how you look at it. It's kind of a bittersweet legacy. If you talk to the Freedom Riders, for example, they're proud of what they did in 1961. They kind of broke the spell of Jim Crow, but they didn't really bring about the moral revolution that they hoped for. Many of them talked about the beloved community, the phrase that Dr. King used so often and that John Lewis continues to use. He was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders. They were able to marshal political pressure to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and other pieces of legislation. But I think many of them will tell you that the fundamental problems, many of them remain. That there's a problem at the heart of America. That's what they were trying to reach, a kind of moral revolution. And even though the national movement may not be as unified as it was prior to Dr. King's assassination 50 years ago, many of his apostles are still going strong in their 80s. And many other younger people. Of course, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think gives a lot of us a great hope. Now we have professional athletes like Colin Kaepernick and LeBron James speaking out in the tradition of Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe, demanding really that they and their colleagues take some responsibility to give back to the black community, to give back to the nation, really, in the sense that they're not just privileged celebrities or athletes, but they have a voice, they care. I think there's a lot of that. You certainly see that in the community here in St. Petersburg. It's a dramatically different place than it was in 1968. It was a pretty ugly place, frankly, for African Americans to try to live then. There were exceptions, but I think most people today, here at least, are people of goodwill, and there's a lot of interaction between the members of the black community and the broader community in St. Petersburg. And I think that's true of communities across the South and really across the nation, despite a lot of ugly incidents that continue to trouble all of us. So it's, as I said, I think it's bittersweet. We haven't reached the beloved community, but we're probably a little closer than we were 50 years ago. And I think many of us know what we need to do. That we need to, our responsibility doesn't end with voting. It only begins with voting. And people need to speak out. They need at some level at least to think of themselves as activists, that they're going to take responsibility for changing the world so that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will not have to face the same horrific obstacles that people faced in the past.